Good to see you. I'm Christopher, and this is Animal Attacks. Today, I'll be taking a look at the United States' most brutal animal attacks ever recorded. From a mechanic in the Nevada desert who handled a 15-foot python alone one too many times, to a confident trail coach who believed he knew how to scare off a bear. It was October 7th, 2018. The hills had turned in the way eastern Kentucky turns in early October. The hardwoods going orange and rust along. The ridgelines, the mornings carrying a chill that hadn't been there a month before. The light sat lower and sharper across the hollow, where James Buckley's property sat back from the road. James was 47 years old. He was a coal equipment mechanic, spent his career on maintenance contract for the mining operations in Harlan County, known for fixing things others had written off. His wife, Carol, was the organizational center of the household, sharp where James was unhurried. Their teenage son, Marcus, had grown up working alongside his father, and Dale, the neighbor there that morning, was a longtime friend going back to when both men worked the same contract in the late 90s. James had raised a black bear from a cub after its mother was killed by a vehicle on a county road 3 years earlier. He kept it in an enclosure he built himself, never registered it, and named it Rue. It had grown into a full adult black bear, several hundred pounds. American black bears are highly intelligent and strongly food motivated, capable of forming associations between specific individuals and the delivery of food that persist across years. And that retention is not affection, it is conditioning. James had hand-fed Rue regularly and continued the practice as she grew. He entered the enclosure for feeding rather than using a pass-through. The boundary between keeper and food source had never been cleanly established, and nothing in 3 years had given anyone in that yard framework for what they were about to see. Rue had changed over the 3 years in ways that James had tracked practically. The size of her enclosure, the quantity of food required, the reinforcement schedule, but had not tracked behaviorally with the same precision. She was heavier and stronger in ways that were obvious. But the behavioral architecture underneath that physical growth, the deepening food conditioning, the accumulated pressure of years of enclosure entry feeding, was less visible precisely because it had developed so gradually. James had managed her successfully throughout, and successful management across time tends to produce its own blind spot. The feeding had been delayed that morning by about an hour and a half. Rue had been pacing the enclosure since her regular window had passed. James recognized the pacing. He had seen it before, and it had always resolved when he arrived with food. He went out to feed her with Carol on the porch, Marcus at the edge of the yard, and Dale leaning against the fence, watching. James entered the enclosure. Rue came toward him the way she always did, and that was precisely the problem. The movement that looked familiar was not the same movement it had been on other mornings. The delay, the food conditioning, the absence of any spatial boundary, it had all converged. The transition from approach to engagement happened in seconds, small enough that Marcus said he didn't register what he was seeing as an attack until it was already fully underway. Carol came off the porch the moment she understood. Marcus was at the gate seconds later. Dale tried to pull it open and couldn't get it unlatched, hands shaking, urgency working against the fine motor control the latch required. Carol went back to the house for the rifle. Marcus got the gate open. None of it was in time. James Buckley died in his enclosure with his family in the yard. Not random, not without precedent, just invisible. The way these dynamics are always invisible to the people closest to them, until the morning they aren't. What Carol and Marcus described in the weeks following was the specific difficulty of grieving something that had also been a part of their daily life. An animal they had known from when it was small enough to hold, that had eaten from their hands, that had been woven into the fabric of the property as completely as anything else on it. The loss was not clean. It carried a complexity that people outside that situation rarely have a framework for, and that complexity did not make the grief smaller. It made it harder to put down. It was October 13th, 2018. A campground near Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee, A Saturday evening in autumn, the air cold and smelling of damp leaves and wood smoke, flashlight beams moving between tents and RVs across the gravel roads. Ethan Walker was 20 and had lost 3 jobs in less than 3 years. At a hardware store, he had climbed shelving instead of using the rolling ladder and knocked boxes into a customer walkway. At a car wash, he had reversed a customer's truck across wet pavement without a manager present and clipped a metal station. At a barbecue restaurant, he had ignored a warning about a slippery kitchen floor, stacked too many trays, and nearly collided with a coworker carrying hot equipment. Each time he had been told clearly what the rule was. Each time he had decided the rule did not apply to him. Each time something had gone wrong, he had found a reason why it was not really his fault. He had started posting videos online. Most of them went nowhere. Then, during a trip to the Smokies in early 2018, he filmed himself climbing a roadside barrier to approach a wild elk while a park employee shouted at him to move back. The elk ignored him and kept grazing. The video spread. Thousands of strangers called him fearless. Ethan replayed the comments for days. For the first time in a long while, attention felt easy. 3 jobs, 1 viral video, and the comments that followed changed everything about how he saw himself. I wish the elk had reacted differently that day. After that, the content changed. Fences, drop-offs, wildlife. By October 2018, he had around 5,600 followers. Not enough to live on, but enough to dominate his attention. The camping trip that weekend had been planned mostly around content. Friends were asked to repeat reactions for better footage. Hiking clips were filmed multiple times. Rangers had spent the weekend reminding campers to secure food and stay at least 150 feet from bears after several sightings near garbage areas earlier in the week. Black bears are highly motivated by high-calorie rewards. Once a bear associates humans or campgrounds with easy food like trash, they become habituated, losing their natural fear of people, which significantly increases the risk of a defensive or predatory encounter. That Saturday evening, a black bear had been spotted near overflowing trash bins deeper inside the campground. The bear was partly turned away, head lowered towards scattered food and garbage, moving slowly. Ethan pulled out his phone almost automatically. One friend laughed nervously and told him he was actually insane. Another kept filming from further back and told him he was already close enough. Ethan kept walking. He stopped briefly to check his screen and make sure both his face and the bear were visible in the frame. 6 feet from a bear, and he stopped to check his framing. His phone was making the animal look further than it was. Every single thing in that moment was working against him. The bear had not reacted aggressively. To Ethan, that seemed reassuring. He moved closer. The bear shifted slightly beside the bin. Ethan interpreted the movement as proof the animal was used to people. Behind him, a friend told him more seriously to back up now. Ethan hesitated, but did not turn around. Too many people were watching behind him, and he was still recording. The bear lifted its head fully. The laughter behind Ethan stopped. The animal focused directly on him. The distance had closed to roughly 15 feet. The bear charged. It covered the gap instantly and made contact before Ethan could move. The initial strike knocked him off his feet. The bear bit into the right side of his neck and shoulder, the force of the jaw crushing the soft tissue and compromising the carotid artery. It drove him into the ground, pinning him by his chest. He had no time to cover himself and nothing to grab onto. His phone was still recording when it hit the ground beside him. Friends screamed. Someone ran for the ranger station. Someone else shouted and threw something toward the animal. The bear disengaged after several seconds and moved back toward the tree line. Rangers reached the scene within minutes. Ethan was unconscious and in profound hypovolemic shock due to rapid blood loss from the neck wounds. Bystanders had attempted to apply pressure, but the depth of the lacerations and the damage to the major vessels made the bleeding difficult to control in a field setting. Emergency responders initiated CPR and maintained advanced life support measures while transporting him to the nearest clearing for air evacuation. However, the physiological toll of the blood loss, combined with the trauma to the cervical spine during the initial strike, resulted in cardiac arrest during transit. Ethan was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the University Medical Center in Knoxville. The bear was tracked and euthanized the following morning. It was a young male that had been feeding on unsecured campground garbage for several days prior to the incident. The footage from Ethan's phone was reviewed as part of the park's incident report. The video showed him continuing to advance after 2 verbal warnings. from his friends, and after the ranger advisory that evening had specifically addressed bear proximity. The park noted that the distance at the point of charge was consistent with a provoked defensive response at close range. No charges were filed. The incident report was added to the park's public safety record. The campground garbage management protocols were reviewed and updated the following season. It was September 17th, 2016, northwestern Montana. Black Rock Canyon Trail cuts through dense forested canyon country known for grizzly bear activity. Trees pressed in on both sides, and the creek bed below the embankment kept visibility short in every direction. Daniel Forsyth was 46. He worked as a civil engineer. Friends described him as someone who was hard to reason with once he had made up his mind. He had been hiking for over 2 decades and believed he knew how to handle himself in the backcountry. He had the gear and the experience, and he trusted both completely. Ruth Forsyth was 44. She worked as a primary school teacher. She had been married to Daniel for 18 years, and the last 14 months had been the hardest. They had stopped talking the way they used to. Small disagreements dragged on longer than they should. Daniel had pulled away from her, and the more she tried to close the distance, the further he went. She had started to wonder whether what they had could still be saved. The trip was her idea. She suggested the trail, and he agreed almost before she finished asking, faster than he had agreed to anything in over a year. That yes meant something to her. They had met on this trail 19 years earlier and got engaged a year after that at a spot just past mile marker 6, where the canyon opened up and the view down the creek stayed with you. They had come back 11 times since. I think about that a lot. She was trying to save her marriage, and that was the trail she picked. The advisory board at the trailhead was clear. Multiple grizzly bears had been confirmed active between mile markers 6 and 9. Feeding had been observed along the creek corridor below mile marker 6, where bears had been drawn to a seasonal food source in that drainage. Hikers were told to turn back at mile marker 5. The warning was current and written in plain language. Daniel read it. Ruth stood beside him and watched him do it. When he finished, she told him it said to turn back at 5. He said they had done this trail 11 times and nothing had ever happened. He had his bear spray. The place they were going was past 6, right where the canyon opened up, the exact spot where he had proposed. He wanted to get there. Ruth told him again the warning was specific. He was already walking. She had not pushed back on him in a long time, and this did not feel like the moment to start. She followed. They crossed mile marker 5 at 9:25 in the morning. The trail got narrower and the brush got thicker on both sides. The creek ran below a short embankment to their left, and the vegetation cut visibility down to just a few meters. The sounds of the canyon, birds and water and wind, faded out in the stretch between the embankment and the tree line above the trail. Neither of them noticed. Daniel caught his foot on a root and glanced down for a moment. What they could not see was that 2 adult bears had been moving through the same creek feeding corridor independently, one working below the embankment to their left and one somewhere in the tree line to the right. The trail ran straight through the middle of that corridor. By the time they entered that stretch, there was no safe distance left in any direction. The bear from the embankment came up fast and hit Daniel from the left side. The force knocked him off the trail and onto the ground. The bear was on him immediately, biting hard into his upper back and neck. Ruth heard him go down and spun toward the sound. She stumbled to the right side of the trail, screaming and calling his name, trying to see him through the brush. That movement and that noise reached the second bear before she did. It had been feeding in the tree line above the trail, and her sudden lateral movement toward it closed the distance faster than either of them could have registered. She got the bear spray up, but she was off balance and pointing the wrong way. The spray went out at the wrong angle and did not build up where it needed to before the bear reached her. It bit into her upper back and neck. She went down and did not get up. The trail went quiet again after. Rangers started a search when the couple did not come back when expected, and their car was still at the trailhead after dark. The search team crossed mile marker 5 and found Daniel and Ruth Forsyth on the trail beyond the advisory boundary. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death for both as traumatic injuries to the neck and upper spine from animal attack with associated blood loss. They were 46 and 44 years old. Post-incident findings confirmed the advisory had been accurate and specific at the time they entered the trail. Both names were in the trailhead register signed after the board had been read. The bear spray had been discharged, but the angle and distance at the time of use meant it never reached effective concentration before contact. Tracks from 2 adult grizzly bears were identified, and the disturbance patterns were consistent with separate approach directions along the same feeding corridor. No immediate removal action was deemed necessary. It was March 15th, 2015. Broward County, Florida, sat under the kind of late winter warmth that the rest of the country hadn't reached yet. Humid, close, the kind of evening that gathers inside a house full of people and makes the air feel thicker than it should. Derek Holloway had hosted gatherings at his place before. He was known in his circle for the Python, had been for years. Derek was 34 years old. He worked as an HVAC technician out of Fort Lauderdale. Reliable, the kind of person who remembered people's names and showed up early without being asked. Outside of work, he was social, liked having his space filled, liked being the reason people gathered. What he knew about Burmese pythons, he had learned through years of dedicated reading and hands-on experience. The kind of self-education that covers most of the ground, but sometimes misses the edge cases until they arrive. He had kept the Burmese python since it was a juvenile, acquired through private channels, raised in an enclosure he had built in a back room, fed on a schedule that had become as routine as any other part of his week. Burmese pythons are one of the largest snake species on Earth, capable of exceeding 6 meters and 90 kilograms. They possess heat-sensing pits along the jaw that detect infrared radiation from warm-blooded animals with a precision that doesn't require sight or smell. In a warm, crowded room, every person present is radiating exactly the kind of thermal signature those pits are built to find. The snake was several meters in length by the time of the incident. There were 7 people in the room when Derek brought the python out. The house was warm. The snake had been in that warmth all evening, its thermal sensitivity responding to an environment saturated with biological signals. Derek had fed it 2 days prior, close enough that the feeding response had not fully reset, far enough that the timing felt unremarkable. He had done this before without incident. When something goes smoothly 20 times, the 21st doesn't feel different until it is. He draped the snake across his shoulders the way he always had. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The python struck at Derek, at the warmth of his body, at the thermal signature of the person holding it in an environment the animal system had been processing for hours. Coils followed with the mechanical inevitability that large constrictor attacks always carry. Not frenzied, not loud, methodical. Constriction works not through suffocation, but cardiovascular arrest. The pressure a large Burmese python exerts is sufficient to prevent the heart from maintaining circulation long before the lungs stop working. The room had 7 people in it. 7 people who were present, who could see what was happening, who wanted to help. 2 grabbed at the coils immediately. The problem was everything around it. The shock, the lack of coordination, the complete absence of anything in that living room designed to interrupt a large constrictor mid-coil. No cutting tool within reach. No one trained in the specific technique, applying pressure behind the jaw, uncoiling from the tail end, that offers the best chance of interruption. They pulled. They repositioned. Someone called 911. Another ran for the kitchen and came back with nothing that worked. None of it came together in time. The cardiovascular compression that large constrictors produce does not pause for people to find their footing. By the time first responders arrived, the window that might have made a difference had already closed. What the witnesses described in the aftermath was not the chaos people might imagine. It was a specific, grinding helplessness. The experience of watching something catastrophic happen in slow motion, while everything you try falls short by a margin you can feel, but can't close. Several of them had interacted with the snake before that evening, had held it, had thought of it as part of what made Derek's place interesting. The investigation documented it clearly. A privately kept exotic constrictor, a warm, crowded environment, a feeding window that had not fully closed, and a handling decision made without the awareness that anything was different about that evening. Nothing about the animal's behavior leading up to the moment had registered as unusual to anyone in the room. That is the specific cruelty of thermal-triggered feeding responses in large constrictors. They do not build visibly. They do not announce themselves. They resolve in the span of time it takes for a room full of people to realize they are not watching a show. Derek Holloway died in his living room with 7 people watching. It wasn't. That's the part that stays with me. Nothing was different until it was. It was September 22, 2017, and a low overcast had settled over the outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the kind of gray midday sky that makes everything feel slightly muted. The temperature was mild, unremarkable, the sort of weather that doesn't stay in your memory. What happened inside a modified garage on a quiet suburban street that afternoon, however, is not the kind of thing that leaves easily. Melissa Grant, 29, lived alone in a home she had gradually adapted around the needs of her most unusual resident. She worked remotely, kept to herself, and by most accounts was thoughtful and organized. Someone who had researched primate care extensively before acquiring the animal and continued reading long after. She had obtained the chimpanzee years earlier, before Oklahoma began tightening its primate ownership laws following a series of high-profile incidents across the country. Under the older framework, private ownership existed in a regulatory gap that was wide enough to drive through without much friction. Melissa had done everything that was technically required of her at the time. That's part of what makes this so hard to categorize. The chimpanzee she kept was an adult male, weighing approximately 140 pounds. That number sounds manageable until you understand what it means in practice. Chimpanzees are not exotic pets in the way people sometimes imagine. Curious, trainable, manageable, with the right approach. Their upper body musculature is dense and fast twitch in ways that human anatomy simply isn't. Specialists in primate behavior are consistent and unambiguous. Private ownership of adult chimpanzees is not a question of whether a serious incident will occur, but when. The animal had already been showing signs of escalating territorial behavior, bending fixtures inside the enclosure, displacing objects during cleaning. Melissa had noted these changes. She hadn't altered her approach. I think she probably told herself she knew him well enough. That's a very human thing to believe, and it's almost never true with an animal like this. On the morning of September 22nd, she entered the enclosure for midday cleaning, removing food containers and replacing them with fresh supplies. It was a task she had performed hundreds of times. The attack began as items were being removed, a pattern consistent with territorial or possession-triggered responses documented in chimpanzee behavior research. Once initiated, the escalation was rapid. Impact marks on the interior walls and overturned containers indicated the violence of what unfolded in that confined space. A chimpanzee of that size, in a territorial state, in an enclosed room, there was no realistic path to escape. A neighbor reported several loud impacts from inside the structure, then silence. Authorities conducted a welfare check after failed contact attempts. The animal was sedated before anyone entered. Melissa was found inside the enclosure. Death was ruled accidental due to traumatic injuries. Local authorities informally tightened restrictions on primate ownership in the area following the incident, though formal legislation remained limited. I've read a lot about chimpanzee incidents in the course of putting these stories together, and the one thing that strikes me every time is how the warning signs are almost always present and almost always misread. Not ignored exactly, misread. Melissa saw the changes in the animal's behavior. She interpreted them as manageable. That gap between observation and action is where these tragedies tend to live. It was August 3rd, 2016, during one of the driest summers Northern California had seen in years. And when conditions get like that, wildlife starts showing up in places you don't usually expect, closer to farms, homes, anywhere they can find food or water. Arjun Mehta, 52, was a software engineer from San Jose, visiting his cousin's mountain farm for the first time in years. He'd spent most of his life in urban environments, far removed from anything like this. Growing up in India, he'd heard stories from his grandfather about driving off leopards and tigers, stories about courage, about protecting your home. And I think those stories stuck with him more than he realized. Because sometimes, when you've heard something enough, it starts to feel like something you could do too. The night before everything happened, a mountain lion had killed several chickens from his cousin's coop. The signs were clear: tracks, scattered feathers, the kind of damage that pointed to a large predator. His cousin already had a plan: move the remaining chickens, contact wildlife officials, handle it the right way. But Arjun didn't like the idea of just waiting, and I get it. Nobody wants to feel like they're just letting something dangerous hang around. But at the same time, there's a difference between wanting to help and actually knowing how to handle the situation. Arjun started thinking of the mountain lion as just a bigger version of the animals from the stories he grew up hearing. Something that could be scared off with enough confidence, which isn't really how it works. He spent the day coming up with what he thought was a solid plan. Nothing complicated, just positioning himself near the house with rocks, ready to scare the animal away if it came back. And I don't know, this is one of those moments where it feels like things are being oversimplified, like treating a wild predator as if it's going to react the way you expect it to. That evening, just before sunset, he saw it. The mountain lion had returned, moving quietly near the chicken coop. This could have been the moment to stay inside, call for help, let someone trained deal with it. Instead, Arjun rushed outside. He grabbed a handful of stones, shouting as he moved toward the animal, throwing them in its direction. In his mind, it probably felt like he was taking control of the situation, doing exactly what those old stories described. But this wasn't the same situation. The mountain lion wasn't out in the open, with room to escape. It was near the barn, with limited space behind it, and without realizing it, Arjun kept moving forward. That's the part that really changes everything, because now, instead of scaring the animal away, he was cutting off its escape route. The mountain lion didn't run, it turned. And when a predator like that feels cornered, it doesn't hesitate. The attack was immediate. The lion launched forward, covering the distance in seconds and knocking Arjun to the ground. During the struggle, it used its hind claws, powerful, sharp, built for gripping and tearing, and struck his upper thigh. The injury was severe. Arjun tried to fight back, but there was no real way to defend against that kind of speed and force. The entire encounter lasted only a few minutes. Then, the mountain lion disengaged and fled. By the time Arjun's cousin came looking for him about 30 minutes later, he was already on the ground behind the barn. The wounds had caused catastrophic damage, including a severed femoral artery, leading to rapid blood loss. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing that could be done. The medical examiner ruled the case an accidental death caused by a mountain lion attack, citing fatal blood loss from the injuries sustained during the encounter. Wildlife officials later tracked the animal and relocated it to a more remote area, determining that its behavior had been defensive. Reports noted that the mountain lion had been reacting to a perceived threat after being cornered. Following the incident, the farm implemented additional safety measures, including motion-activated lighting and reinforced enclosures for livestock. Local authorities also used the case to educate residents on proper wildlife response protocols. No further mountain lion incidents were reported in the area after those changes were put in place. It was August 4th, 2014. The heat sat over the land the way Central Texas heat always does in early August. Heavy, flat, radiating back up from the earth. On rural properties outside any municipal boundary, the afternoon carried the particular stillness of a place far enough from infrastructure that the world, beyond the fence line, barely registers. Ray Garza's property was that kind of place. He had built it to be. Ray was 51 years old. He had spent 20 years as a pipeline inspector in the oil and gas sector before an early retirement following a back injury. The rural property outside Bastrop was what he had worked toward. Land, distance, self-sufficiency. He was private but not unfriendly, the kind of man who helped without being asked and expected nothing in return. The tiger was consistent with who he was, an extension of the impulse to do something nobody he knew had done, on land he had earned. He had kept a Bengal tiger on his property for 6 years, acquired as a cub through back-channel connections in the private exotic animal trade. No permit, no registration. He called it Sultan. Bengal tigers are estimated by wildlife organizations to number in the thousands in private U.S. ownership, more held privately in Texas alone than exist in the wild across all of India. They reach full adult size between 3 and 4 years, with males regularly exceeding 200 kilograms, and their territorial range in the wild can exceed 100 square kilometers. An enclosure is not a territory. It is a compression of everything that territory is for. Sultan had become something of an open secret in Ray's world, not widely known, but known enough that a small orbit of people understood what was on that property and had made peace with it. Ray spoke about the tiger, the way people speak about things they have lived alongside long enough to stop fearing, not recklessly, but with the settled confidence of someone who had managed the situation successfully across years and had drawn conclusions from that success. 6 years without a serious incident is a long time. It is also, in the context of a fully grown Bengal tiger, exactly long enough to stop feeling like luck. The gathering that afternoon was a family event. Ray's wife, his adult son, 2 grandchildren under 10, a brother-in-law down from Austin. People who had seen Sultan before, who understood in the abstract that the animal was dangerous, but for whom that danger had been softened by repetition into something that felt theoretical. Ray fed Sultan in front of family routinely. Their experience said this was safe. The feeding that afternoon had been delayed by nearly 3 hours. In the management of large captive felids, a delayed feeding is not a neutral event. Bengal tigers operate on internal rhythms that do not flex easily around human scheduling. And the longer the delay, the more the animal's arousal builds towards something that is no longer simply hunger. Sultan had been pacing and vocalizing for over an hour before Ray went in. The signals were there, and the family gathered outside the fence was not trained to read them. Ray entered the enclosure with the feed. The attack came fast. His wife screamed. His son reached the fence and tried to get the gate open, but the latch, the same one that kept Sultan contained, now kept everyone else out. His brother-in-law ran for the house to find a weapon. The grandchildren were pulled back by instinct. It was over before the firearm was retrieved. What the family described afterward, and what families in documented big cat incidents across the United States have described in consistent terms, is the way the fence transformed the experience of witnessing into something different from ordinary helplessness. They could see everything. The distance between them and Ray at any given moment was measured in meters, not miles. And none of that proximity translated into the ability to do anything that mattered. Ray Garza died inside the enclosure in front of 5 members of his family. The investigation documented a privately kept, unregistered Bengal tiger, an illegal arrangement maintained in secrecy for 6 years, and a set of variables: delayed feeding, high ambient temperature, keeper entering during peak arousal, that the animal's behavioral state had been building toward all afternoon. No fence in the world keeps a family out faster than it keeps an apex predator in. It was March 3rd, 2015, and the western North Carolina mountains were still carrying the last of winter. Bare hardwoods, cold air with a faint smell of wood smoke, the kind of late afternoon light that fades faster than you expect once it starts going. On a multi-acre wooded property outside Asheville, the enclosures were well built and the routines were established. Harold Finch, 55, had been keeping exotic animals for over a decade, and by most measures, he knew what he was doing. That's what makes his case so difficult to categorize. Harold wasn't a hobbyist operating on instinct. He was a collector with experience, someone who had invested seriously in infrastructure and took the responsibility of ownership genuinely. North Carolina's exotic animal laws had long existed as a patchwork. Some counties permitted private ownership with minimal oversight, and no uniform statewide ban was in place during this period. Harold operated within that framework, legally and with documentation. His Bengal tiger, approximately 500 pounds, housed in a 40 by 60 foot steel enclosure, had been in his care for years without a serious incident. The enclosure was structurally sound. The feeding schedule was consistent. Harold had done most things right. Most things. Bengal tigers are the largest of the tiger subspecies, and they are built around a single evolutionary principle: the ambush. Their muscular structure is optimized for explosive acceleration over short distances. They can cover ground faster than most people can process what they're seeing. More relevant than their speed, though, is their silence. A Bengal tiger, moving with intent, produces almost no sound. No warning vocalization, no displacement of air that registers as a threat. They approach from behind, targeting the back of the neck or the upper spine, and the strike is initiated only when the prey's attention is directed elsewhere. This is not aggression in the way people typically imagine it. It is precision. And the trigger, more often than almost anything else, is a turned back at close range. Harold knew this. He had read it, likely repeated it to others. The one practice that safety guidelines flag consistently for large predator management is this: never lose visual contact with the animal at close range. It sounds almost too simple to be the thing that matters most. Feeding involved distributing approximately 15 pounds of raw meat across multiple points inside the enclosure, a practice meant to encourage natural foraging behavior. Harold had moved through the space, placing portions along the ground, when a piece of meat dropped near the rear section. He turned away from the tiger to retrieve it. That was the moment. Scuff marks in the soil and the position of the dropped meat told investigators exactly what had happened. A silent approach, no warning, immediate contact. The tiger had covered the distance before Harold had fully straightened up. No one heard anything significant. Nearby resident reported a brief, low disturbance, then nothing. Harold was found the following morning by a grounds worker. The tiger was tranquilized and removed by responding authorities. Investigators found no structural failure in the enclosure, no negligence in the setup, no systemic breakdown in the operation. The incident was attributed entirely to a single lapse in visual awareness during close-range feeding, one moment of inattention in a decade of careful work. I find that harder to sit with than the cases involving obvious recklessness. Harold had done so much right, and the animal didn't malfunction or behave abnormally. It did exactly what a Bengal tiger is built to do when a large animal turns its back at close range. There's no villain in this story, just a predator acting on instinct, and a man who looked away at the wrong second. It was the 18th of June, 2017, Bridger Teton National Forest, Wyoming. Open alpine terrain, broken up by patches of mixed forest and brush, grizzly bear country, the kind of landscape where you can see a long way in some directions, and nothing at all in others, depending on where the vegetation closes in. Philip Crane was 43. He worked as a high school science teacher in Casper. He had been hiking recreationally for years, and had recently completed a wilderness safety course that included bear encounter protocols. He had come away from it confident and well prepared, or at least that was how it felt. He was leading a small group that day and had explained bear behavior at the trailhead before they set out. Let me be fair here. He had just completed a wilderness safety course, but what the course could not prepare him for was what his own body would do in the half second after the first charge stopped. The bear appeared at a distance, open stretch of trail, and began moving toward them. Philip told the group to hold, and they held. The bear came fast, closing the gap in a rush, then stopped somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 meters out. It looked like a bluff charge, close enough to what he had read about that he held his position and did not run. The first phase had gone roughly the way the training described. Not perfectly, but close, enough that he was still standing. Then the tension broke. The adrenaline that had been building through the charge released all at once, and something involuntary came out of him. A short, sharp sound, somewhere between a shout and a laugh. The kind of thing a body produces when it has been braced for impact, and the impact does not arrive. It lasted less than a second. He had not chosen to make it. The bear was already highly aroused from the charge, already at close range, already in the middle of an assessment that had not been resolved. The vocalization may have contributed to what followed, but the bear was already operating at a level of stress and proximity where very little was needed to tip the interaction. What caused the second charge to begin cannot be stated with certainty. What is clear is that it followed almost immediately. The distance was already gone. The bear came to the remaining ground without stopping. The group behind Philip broke and ran when the second charge began. The bear remained fixed on Philip at the closest point. Philip was the nearest target, and the bear reached him. The bear hit Philip and drove him to the ground. It bit into his upper back and shoulder, and the force was immediate and significant. He tried to cover his neck with his arms, but the bear's weight pinned him, and the biting continued across his back and the back of his head before the bear disengaged and moved off. Philip lay on the ground and did not get up. The rest of the group reached the trailhead and reported the encounter. A search response was initiated, and a team followed the trail back into the area. Philip Crane was located near the encounter site. He was alive but severely injured, with deep lacerations and bite wounds across his upper back, shoulders, and the back of his head. He was airlifted to hospital, where he underwent surgery. He survived, but sustained permanent damage to his shoulder and partial hearing loss on one side from the head injuries. Post-incident review noted that Philip had followed correct bear encounter protocol through the first charge. The involuntary vocalization at close range during the assessment phase was identified as a possible contributing factor to the escalation, but reviewers noted the bear had already been in a highly aroused state at reduced distance, and that the interaction may have escalated regardless. The review noted that the group breaking and running during the second charge did not redirect the bear. No fault was identified with the trail operation or the terrain. The bear was not located for removal assessment. The plan accounted for behavior. It was July 28, 2018, and the Louisiana summer was doing what Louisiana summers do, pressing heat and humidity into every corner of the day. The air thick enough that even standing still felt like effort. By late afternoon outside Baton Rouge, the light had gone gold and heavy, and the surface of the water in Eric Landry's backyard enclosure sat completely still, reflecting nothing. Eric, 38, had built the enclosure himself over the course of about 2 years. A 20-foot long, 4-foot deep structure with a water section that took up roughly half the total space. He was a detail-oriented man by nature, the kind of person who documented his builds and took quiet pride in doing things properly. Louisiana has a long-established alligator, farming and handling industry, and private ownership of American alligators, while regulated, existed within a framework that experienced handlers could navigate. Eric had the permits. He had the paperwork. What he had built was, on paper, compliant. The animal he kept inside it was an American alligator, approximately 11 feet long and over 500 pounds. A species that has remained essentially unchanged for 37 million years because nothing about its design needed improving. I think about that sometimes. An animal that has outlasted almost everything else on this continent, and someone decided to keep one in their backyard in Baton Rouge. American alligators are ambush predators, and their entire anatomy is organized around that single strategy. Their eyes and nostrils sit at the very top of the skull, allowing them to remain almost entirely submerged while maintaining full sensory awareness of the surface above. They can hold their breath for up to 2 hours. In murky water, they are functionally invisible, and when they strike, the movement from stillness to full contact is among the fastest predatory actions in the animal kingdom. Studies have clocked the initial lunge at under 150 milliseconds. The bite force of a large adult exceeds 2,000 pounds per square inch, among the highest recorded for any living animal. What follows the bite is the death roll, a full-body rotation used to disorient prey and drag it below the surface. It is not a defensive behavior, it is a feeding behavior. The water in the enclosure had developed significant algae and sediment buildup over the preceding weeks, reducing visibility below the surface to near zero. Eric was aware of it. Cleaning was on his list, but on July 28th, he entered the enclosure for a late afternoon feeding before the water had been cleared, approaching the waterline carrying food, in conditions that were meaningfully different from the ones he'd grown accustomed to. No overhead barriers, no external feeding system, no protected approach path had been installed. The enclosure was well built, but the safety architecture around the feeding process had never been completed. Eric was at the water's edge when the alligator came up from below the surface with no visible warning. The bite was immediate, followed by the death roll, a full-body rotation that pulled him toward the deeper section of the enclosure. Disturbed water, mud displacement, and drag marks told the story of what followed. He had no barrier between himself and the water. In conditions where he couldn't see the animal had seen him perfectly. A nearby resident reported a sudden splash and a brief disturbance, then silence. Eric was reported missing later that evening. Authorities searched the enclosure and recovered remains from the water. The alligator was euthanized due to immediate risk. The case was later referenced in regional safety discussions, though it received limited public coverage. What stays with me about Eric's case is the water visibility. That single factor, sediment and algae obscuring the surface, transformed a dangerous situation into a fatal one. He couldn't see the animal. The animal could detect him perfectly. That asymmetry in a shared space with no barriers left no margin at all. It's the kind of detail that seems almost incidental until you understand what it actually meant. It was July 22nd, 2016, right in the middle of a Florida summer. And if you've ever heard anything about Florida, you already know the wildlife doesn't exactly chill out during this time. If anything, it gets more active, more aggressive. So hearing that a group of guys decided to camp near a remote canal at night, yeah, that already sounds like the start of a bad idea. Kian Vasquez was 28, a construction worker who had just moved to Tampa from Arizona about 6 months earlier. And I kinda get it. If you grow up somewhere dry, where the most dangerous thing you deal with is maybe a rattlesnake, it's easy to underestimate how different Florida is. But still, I feel like at some point you'd at least ask someone, right? Especially when locals literally treat certain areas like no-go zones after dark. Kian had this reputation for being fearless, but honestly, it sounds more like he just didn't know where the line was. You know those people who always take things one step further than everyone else, just to prove they can? Yeah, that kind of energy. That night, he and a group of co-workers had just wrapped up a long week and decided to camp near one of these canals. They'd been drinking for hours, and you can probably already imagine how the mood shifted. Jokes getting louder, dares getting thrown around, people trying to outdo each other. Then someone spots a pair of glowing red eyes in the water, and I don't know about you, but that's the exact moment I'm calling it a night. No hesitation, but instead it turns into a challenge. Who's brave enough to get closer? Kian takes it personally. He starts talking about how he's not afraid of any reptile, brushing it off like it's nothing. At first, his friends are laughing, but you can tell it slowly turns into concern when he actually starts taking off his clothes and stepping toward the water. He strips down to his boxers and walks straight into the canal. Almost immediately, the alligator strikes. No warning, no buildup, just pure speed. It lunges from the darkness, clamps onto his upper thigh, and starts a death roll. It's violent, disorienting, and over in seconds. Then, just as quickly, it lets go, which honestly feels like the only lucky break he got that entire night. The noise from the shoreline probably scared it off, and Kian manages to stumble back out of the water. He's bleeding, clearly injured, but he's conscious, alive. His friends rush in, drag him out, panicking, but also probably thinking the worst is over. And here's where things take a turn that's honestly more frustrating than the attack itself. Because Kian starts joking. He downplays it, acts like it's not a big deal, like he just got lucky, and that's the end of it. He wraps his leg in a dirty shirt and insists he doesn't need a hospital. His friends tell him to get medical help. He refuses. And I keep thinking, was it pride, embarrassment, not wanting to admit he took it too far? Because that one decision, that's really what sealed everything. Over the next couple of days, his condition gets worse. The swelling increases, the skin changes color, the pain intensifies. What probably looked like just a bite starts turning into something way more serious. Infections from alligator bites are no joke. The bacteria in their mouths can spread fast, and in his case, it turns into severe cellulitis. By day 3, it's already bad. By day 4, it's critical. The infection enters his bloodstream, and he develops sepsis, his body basically going into full system failure trying to fight it off. He collapses in his apartment, and by the time paramedics arrive, there's nothing they can do. The medical examiner later confirmed it. Septic shock from an untreated alligator bite. And what really sticks with me here is how preventable it was. Antibiotics, proper wound care, even just going to the hospital that same night could have changed everything. It was the 16th of July, 2019, Flathead National Forest, northern Montana, a trail running route through mixed forest that Kevin Marsh had used roughly 60 times. He knew where it turned, where it dipped, where the light changed through the canopy. He knew it the way you know a road you drive every week without thinking about it anymore. Kevin Marsh was 38. He worked as a trail running coach and had built a modest following through his writing. One of his most read pieces was titled Bear Country Running: How to Stay Safe. It had picked up around 4,000 views. The guidance in it was sound. Make regular vocal noise on the trail. Slow your pace near blind corners and water crossings. Do not wear headphones in known bear corridors. He had written all of it from experience, and he believed it. He wrote the guide. He believed every word of it. That morning, he put his headphones in anyway. I understand why. The week had been difficult, and he needed the distance. But the forest did not care about his week. Tuesday was his long run day. He had been dealing with a difficult week. A scheduling dispute with a client had been going back and forth for several days, and that morning it had escalated into something that was still unresolved when he pulled into the trailhead car park. He sat in the car for a few minutes before getting out. He put his headphones in before he started running. He had not worn them on this trail before. He started at full pace. The trail passed through 2 creek crossings. Both sat inside documented high activity zones, one near a berry patch at mile 4, the other further along where the trail dipped toward the water and the vegetation closed in on both sides. These were the kinds of spots he had written about specifically. The creek noise covered approach sounds. The terrain cut sightlines to a few meters. Anyone moving fast and not making noise was invisible to the environment, and the environment was invisible to them. He passed the first creek without incident. The music was playing. His pace was steady. Somewhere near mile 4, a disturbance moved through the brush ahead of him, a brief shift. In the vegetation, then stillness. He did not register it. He kept running. The second creek crossing came up the way it always did. The trail curved left and dropped slightly before opening onto the bank. He had run this section dozens of times in every season. His pace did not change as he came around the curve. The grizzly was at the waterline with its head down, feeding. The bear may have been aware of something approaching, but not enough to identify it as a threat before the distance collapsed. The creek covered the sound of his footsteps, and the headphones covered Kevin's ears. By the time either of them had any awareness of the other, Kevin was already within roughly 10 meters and still moving at running pace. At that distance, a startled grizzly does not have time to assess, and neither does a person. The response was immediate, and there was no interval between detection and contact in which any of the options Kevin had written about could have been applied. The grizzly made contact before Kevin had fully processed what was in front of him. The force of the initial strike knocked him off the trail. The bear bit into his upper back and shoulder, and the weight behind it drove him to the ground. He had no footing to push back from, and no distance or time to draw and deploy the spray on his belt. The bear held the bite. The injuries to the upper back and neck region were immediately incapacitating. He did not get up. Kevin Marsh did not complete the run. His vehicle remained at the trailhead through the afternoon. When he did not return by early evening, someone raised the alarm and a search was initiated. The team followed his usual route into the forest. They found him near the Second Creek crossing. He was 38 years old. The cause of death was consistent with a grizzly bear encounter at close range. The investigation noted that the trail passed through a documented high-activity zone, that the creek crossing limited sound and visibility, and that Kevin had been running at full pace without making noise and with headphones in at the time of the encounter. His blog post remained online. The comments stayed open. People continued to find it through search. It was November 11th, 2013, and the Arizona desert outside Yuma was doing what it rarely gets credit for, being cold. Not the sharp cold of northern winters, but the dry, biting chill that settles into desert air after dark. The kind that catches people off guard because they associate the landscape with heat. The morning had started clear and still, the kind of quiet that makes a property feel more isolated than it actually is. Leonard Pike, 61, was retired, and the compound behind his residence had become the primary project of his later years. He'd spent decades working before stepping back, and the animals, particularly the Bengal tiger he'd acquired several years prior, had given his days structure and purpose. Arizona was, and remains, one of the more permissive states in the country regarding exotic animal ownership. Private big cat ownership was legal with limited oversight. Enclosure standards varied widely by county, and the regulatory framework leaned heavily on self-reporting. Leonard had his paperwork in order. He operated within the law as it existed. That's an important detail, because it means the failure here wasn't legal. It was structural, and it had been visible for some time. Bengal tigers are not animals that test boundaries occasionally. They test them constantly, methodically, and with a patience that outlasts most owners' attention spans. In captivity, they pace fence lines, probe weak points, and apply pressure to structures repeatedly over time, not out of distress necessarily, but because movement and investigation are hardwired into their behavior. A tiger that has identified a weak point in its enclosure will return to it. Wildlife containment specialists note that ground-level vulnerabilities are among the most common failure points in private enclosures, because erosion and soil shift happen gradually and are easy to underestimate until the gap is already significant. The steel holds, the ground beneath it moves, and the animal notices before the owner does. Leonard's enclosure was a 35 by 50-foot steel structure anchored into concrete footings, substantial by most private standards. But along the base of the fence line, soil erosion and minor burrowing had created weak points. Over time, gaps where the ground had shifted away from the steel. Leonard had observed them. Partial repairs had been made. The gaps had not been fully closed. Containment standards for large predators are explicit. Reinforced ground barriers and double gate entry systems are not optional features. They are the difference between a secure enclosure and one that is waiting for the right amount of pressure. I think about how many times Leonard must have walked past those weak points and told himself he'd get to it properly. I've done the same thing with far less consequential problems, and I still feel uneasy about it. On the morning of November 11th, Leonard approached the enclosure carrying approximately 12 pounds of raw meat for the morning feeding. What he didn't know, couldn't have known from the approach path, was that the tiger had already found the weakened section at the base of the fence line. The animal had forced through the gap, widening it, and exited the enclosure before Leonard reached the gate. Tracks in disturbed soil indicated the tiger had moved freely beyond the enclosure perimeter before the attack occurred. The encounter happened outside in open ground within a short distance of the breach point. There was nothing between Leonard and the animal. A nearby resident reported a brief disturbance, then silence. Leonard was found later that afternoon after failing to return inside the residence. Authorities located the tiger near the property and euthanized it due to immediate risk. Inspection confirmed structural failure along the fence base, consistent with erosion and sustained pressure from the animal over time. The incident prompted a local review of private exotic animal containment standards in the region. What separates Leonard's case from every other story in this collection is geography. Every other incident happened inside an enclosure, in a space that was, at least in theory, designed to contain the risk. Leonard's happened outside, in open ground, because the boundary he had relied on had already failed before he arrived. The enclosure didn't hold, and by the time he reached the gate, the situation had already moved beyond it. It was August 3rd, 2015, Route National Forest, Colorado, a dispersed backcountry campsite in mixed forest terrain known for black bear activity. The kind of site experienced campers find without much effort, quiet, off the main routes. The sort of place that feels familiar the moment you set up. Gary Tipton was 45. He worked as a high school geography teacher in Pueblo, Colorado. He had been car camping for years and had completed 40 trips across 11 states before this one. He had never used proper food storage methods on any of them. No bear hang, no bear box. No separation between food and sleeping area. Nothing had ever happened. 40 trips and not a single problem. That record was the most important thing he carried into every campsite. 11 states, not one problem. I want to be honest. If I had that record, I might start to think the same way he did. That is what makes this case so easy to understand and so difficult to watch unfold. This campsite had a bear box. It was a 10-minute walk from where he pitched his tent. He noted it when he arrived and did not use it. He cooked bacon at 6 in the evening. The high-fat cooking residue moved through the trees the way it does, heavy and far-reaching. He cooked again at 10 at night, a late meal before bed. He left the residue on the stove where it sat. Before he got into his sleeping bag, he applied scented lip balm and placed his food bag in the tent vestibule, the covered outer section of the tent, separated from where he was sleeping by a single layer of tent fabric. His hiking partner was camped roughly 30 meters away. The partner had hung their food using a proper PCT hang, suspending it well away from the sleeping area with no food odors left near the tent. The two camps sat in the same forest that night under different conditions. Bears navigate by scent. They can detect food odors across distances that would surprise most people, and they move toward the strongest source with focus and consistency. What Gary had built over the course of that evening was a layered scent trail, pointing in a single direction. High-fat cooking residue twice over, grease on the stove, an unsecured food bag at the entrance to his tent, separated from him by fabric alone. Scented product applied directly to his face. Each element on its own would have been enough to draw interest. Together, they created a continuous gradient, pointing straight at where he was sleeping. The bear entered the campsite sometime in the night following that gradient. It did not remain at the partner's hang. There was nothing there to compete with the stronger source nearby. It continued along the scent trail until it reached Gary's tent. It pushed into the vestibule and began pulling at the food bag. The noise woke Gary. He moved inside the tent, disoriented and in the dark. And as the bear breached the vestibule, the barrier between them collapsed into immediate contact. The bear reacted to the sudden presence with a short defensive burst, biting into his face and upper chest and swiping hard before disengaging. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but the injuries to his face, neck, and chest were severe. The noise brought other campers out of their sleep. They emerged from their tents shouting and banging whatever they could find, moving toward Gary's campsite with torches. The bear registered the disturbance and moved back into the tree line. The campers reached Gary and found him on the ground outside the torn tent, bleeding heavily from his face, neck, and chest. They applied pressure to the wounds and tried to keep him still. He was conscious for a short time, enough to register that people were with him, and then lost consciousness before he could give a clear response. His condition deteriorated steadily from that point. The injuries were too extensive, and the bleeding too heavy for field treatment to hold. Someone called emergency services. The campsite was remote, and the hour was late, and it took time for paramedics to reach them. When they arrived, they worked on Gary at the scene, but he had already succumbed to his injuries before evacuation could begin. Gary Tipton was pronounced dead at the campsite. The cause of death was recorded as severe traumatic injuries and blood loss consistent with a bear attack at close range inside a tent. Post-incident findings confirmed the food storage guidelines had not been followed, despite a bear box being available at the site. Evening had created a concentrated scent environment at the sleeping location. The partner's use of proper food hang protocols was noted in the review. The bear had followed the only thing that had been made consistent. The partner 30 meters away followed the protocols. The bear walked straight past their camp. Gary's record of 40 trips without incident ended on trip 41. That breaks my heart. It was June 11th, 2014, out in rural Texas, and this wasn't your typical animal setup. This was part of the underground exotic animal trade, the kind of place most people don't even realize exists until something goes wrong. And I've heard about situations like this before, people thinking they can handle animals that were never meant to be handled in the first place. Cassian Roque, 38, had been running an illegal tiger breeding operation on his 20-acre property for about 3 years. He started with 2 tigers and eventually expanded to 6 adults. And somewhere along the way, he convinced himself he understood them, which, I don't know, always feels like a dangerous mindset when you're dealing with animals that weigh hundreds of pounds and are built to kill. Cassian believed in dominance, that animals respected strength, control, authority. And over time, he got comfortable, too. Comfortable walking into their enclosures like it was just part of his routine. What made things worse was how he had them set up. In one enclosure, he kept a full-grown male tiger with a female he was trying to breed. And from what I've seen, even professionals treat that kind of situation carefully, especially around feeding time, because food changes everything. On the day things went wrong, Cassian followed his usual routine. He dragged 2 deer carcasses into the enclosure and tossed them down for the tigers. Immediately, their behavior shifted. Both animals became alert, tense, focused. The male started asserting control over one carcass, while the female moved in, testing boundaries. And this is the part where most people would step back and give them space. Cassian did the opposite. He grabbed a wooden stick, something he normally used to manage them, and walked straight into the enclosure. And I keep thinking, what made him believe this would work? Every time? Because animals aren't predictable like that, especially not when food is involved. The moment he stepped in, the situation changed. The tension between the 2 tigers redirected. Instead of competing with each other, their attention shifted toward him. Now, he wasn't the one in control. He was the disruption. Cassian started shouting, waving the stick, trying to assert dominance the way he always had. But this time, it meant nothing. The male tiger moved first. It lunged forward with full force, knocking Cassian off balance and bringing him to the ground. Before he could react, the tiger clamped onto his neck. Almost immediately, the second tiger joined in, and at that point, there was no recovering from it. 2 apex predators, already heightened by food aggression, reacting purely on instinct. There's no space for control in that situation. The attack was fast. There was no chance for Cassian to retreat, no time to reach the enclosure gate, no real way to defend himself. Within moments, the injuries were fatal, and what stands out is how quickly it all shifted from routine to irreversible in seconds. The property was isolated, with no nearby neighbors close enough to hear anything. Once the attack ended, the tigers disengaged and returned to feeding, showing no continued aggression beyond that moment. The next morning, Cassian's feed supplier arrived for a scheduled delivery. That's when the scene was discovered. Cassian's body was found near the enclosure gate he never reached. The injuries were consistent with a fatal neck bite, resulting in massive blood loss. Authorities responded by securing the property and removing all 6 tigers. The animals were transferred to accredited sanctuaries, where they were evaluated and placed under proper care without further incident. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by an exotic animal attack. Investigators cited unsafe handling practices and illegal ownership as major contributing factors. The property was later dismantled, and the incident was used by wildlife officials as a case study, highlighting the risks of keeping apex predators without proper training, facilities, or legal oversight. It was August 17, 2014, and the Mojave Desert heat had already pushed past 104 degrees by mid-morning, baking the cracked asphalt outside Pahrump, Nevada, into something that shimmered at the edges. The kind of heat that makes the air feel thick, like it's pressing down on you. Inside Daniel Reeves's detached garage, a single box fan pushed warm air in slow circles, doing almost nothing against the temperature. Daniel, 34, was a freelance auto mechanic who operated out of that same garage. Engine parts stacked along one wall, tools hanging from pegboard, and tucked against the far end. Row of modified enclosures he'd built himself from stacked glass tanks and wooden framing. He was the kind of man who preferred animals to most people, methodical in his routines and quietly proud of the systems he'd built. Nevada was one of the least restrictive states in the country when it came to exotic animal ownership. No formal inspection requirements, no permit process for large constrictors, and a private breeder culture that operated largely without oversight. In Nye County, where Pahrump sits, enforcement only happened when someone complained. Nobody had complained about Daniel. His largest animal was a Burmese python, approximately 15 feet long and weighing over 120 pounds. Burmese pythons are one of the largest snake species on Earth, capable of reaching 18 feet and 200 pounds in adulthood. They are not venomous. They don't need to be. Constriction works by exploiting the breathing cycle. Each time the prey exhales, the coils tighten incrementally, reducing the space available for the next inhale. A snake of this size can exert enough pressure to prevent the human chest wall from expanding at all. Death follows not from crushing, but from the inability to breathe. That distinction matters because it means the process is not fast. I think about that more than I'd like to. Daniel followed a fixed schedule for feeding and enclosure maintenance, and he handled the snake alone every single time, without restraint tools or a second person present. Care guidelines for snakes exceeding 10 feet are explicit. At minimum, 2 handlers should be present during any direct contact. A previous acquaintance had watched Daniel work with the animal on more than one occasion and quietly stopped coming around afterward. That detail sticks with me. Someone saw enough to walk away, and nothing changed. What made the morning of August 17th particularly significant was timing. The python was approaching the end of its feeding window, a period when feeding response behavior is measurably heightened. The animal's tongue would have been working the air constantly, picking up heat signatures and chemical traces from everything in the enclosure and beyond it. At that stage, proximity and warmth register as a single signal. The snake wasn't aggressive by nature, but biology doesn't negotiate. Daniel opened the enclosure fully to remove substrate and water containers, the same way he had done dozens of times before. The routine was so familiar that it had probably stopped feeling like a risk at all. That's the part that unsettles me most. Not recklessness, but repetition. The way familiarity quietly erodes caution until the two are indistinguishable. The python struck at close range and began constriction almost immediately, forming coils around Daniel's upper torso and neck before he could create distance. Additional loops tightened across his chest and arms, compressing the ribcage with the slow, mechanical force that makes Burmese pythons so uniquely dangerous. A heat lamp and plastic basin had been displaced inside the enclosure, evidence of a struggle that was confined and prolonged in a space that offered no room to maneuver. A nearby resident reported a single heavy impact from the direction of the garage. No further sounds followed. Daniel was found that afternoon after he missed scheduled work. The python was still partially coiled around his body when authorities arrived. Removal required control equipment and multiple responders. Death was ruled accidental, constriction during improper solo handling. The remaining reptiles on the property were seized, and the incident prompted a local review of exotic animal safety practices. By then, the only person those guidelines might have protected was already gone. I've thought about this one more than most. Daniel wasn't careless in the way people imagine when they picture these incidents. He was experienced, he was consistent, and he genuinely cared for his animals. But experience without precaution is its own kind of vulnerability. And in a garage in the Nevada desert, that distinction cost him everything. It was September 16, 2018, Gallatin National Forest, Montana. A canyon trail running through dense brush with rock walls rising on both sides. The terrain funneled movement in one direction and limited visibility to a short stretch ahead. Sound carried differently in the canyon depending on the wind. It was a known grizzly bear country, and both hikers knew that before they started. Aaron Whitfield was 39. He worked as a structural engineer for a firm in Bozeman and had been hiking seriously since his early 20s. He had introduced Jess to trail hiking not long after they met, and over the years she had grown comfortable on most terrain, though she still deferred to him on route decisions and gear. They had been married for 11 years. Their youngest daughter had just left for boarding school the previous month, the last of their children to go, and the house had been quieter than either of them had expected. The trip had been Aaron's suggestion, just the two of them, the way things had been before the children came. Jess had agreed without hesitation. Their youngest had just left for boarding school. The house was quiet for the first time in years. Aaron suggested the trip, and Jess agreed without hesitation. I keep thinking about how normal that sounds, how ordinary the reason for going was. Jess Whitfield was also 39. She worked as a practice manager at a dental clinic in Bozeman. Hiking was not something she had grown up with. Aaron had brought her into it gradually, and she had come to enjoy it, particularly the longer canyon routes, where the terrain felt dramatic without being technical. She trusted his judgment on the trail the way she trusted it most places. They had come prepared. Bear spray was clipped to both hip holsters with the safety tabs already removed. They were moving at a controlled pace and making regular noise as they walked. Everything about their approach to the trail was correct. The grizzly appeared ahead of them at roughly 60 meters. Both hikers stopped immediately. They stood together, spoke in calm, steady voices, and held the spray at low ready. The bear was watching them and beginning to close the distance slowly. They held their position and kept talking. The bear continued to approach. As the distance came down to around 30 meters, Aaron shifted slightly forward, The adjustment placed him closer to the bear than Jess. He was now the nearest point of contact. The bear closed the remaining distance rapidly. Aaron deployed the spray. The cloud caught the edge of the approach and disrupted the bear's focus, but not enough to stop the charge at that distance. The bear reached Aaron. It bit into his upper back and neck and pinned him under its weight, maintaining contact through repeated force. The injuries were severe and rapidly incapacitating. A ranger already in the canyon corridor, moving through the trail system after recent bear activity reports in the area, changed direction when human voices shifted from routine noise to distress. Coming into a position. With sightlines to the trail, the ranger deployed bear spray from a distance that allowed the cloud to form fully. The secondary spray cloud reached effective concentration across the trail before the bear could re-engage with Jess. The bear disengaged and redirected away from her and out of the immediate area. The ranger got on the radio immediately and called for additional personnel and emergency medical response. Jess was kept back while the ranger moved toward Aaron. He was on the ground in the encounter zone, unresponsive, with severe injuries to his neck and upper back. The ranger attempted to control the bleeding as best as the injury location allowed and maintained that until additional personnel arrived. Paramedics were dispatched, but the canyon location added time to the response. By the time medical support reached the scene, Aaron Whitfield had lost too much blood. He was pronounced dead at the site. He was 39 years old. Jess was uninjured. Post-incident review noted that both hikers had followed correct bear encounter protocol from the initial sighting. It was July 9th, 2016, along a gravel pull-off on the Denali Highway, mile marker 118, where the asphalt gives way to raw Alaska and the tree line swallows everything that moves. Brock Marin, 34, spent most of his off time in Wasilla watching football and tinkering with small engines. The camping trip had been his girlfriend Dara's idea. She'd grown up in rural Montana and had pushed for it repeatedly. Brock had no prior camping experience, owned no outdoor gear, and had purchased the bear spray the morning they left, still in the cardboard packaging when they pitched the tent. He seems like a pushover to me. A black bear had been working the tree line adjacent to the campsite for at least 20 minutes before the incident. American black bears in interior Alaska are not the timid garbage raiders of the lower 48. Adult males in this region regularly exceed 400 pounds, sustained by dense summer foraging. They are fast over short ground, capable of 25 miles per hour across rough terrain, and when agitated, their behavior escalates with little transition between curious and aggressive. They are not naturally predatory toward humans, but they respond to sudden movement, unfamiliar scent, and perceived threat with speed that most people are cognitively unprepared to process. Dara's small mixed-breed dog, tied to a stake near the fire ring, began barking and then broke its lead. The bear gave chase. Neither Brock nor Dara retreated to their truck, which was 40 feet away. Dara moved toward the passenger door, but stopped when Brock turned toward the animal. A hiker named Petrov, camped roughly 60 yards down the pull-off with a clear sightline, later told rangers he had watched the bear circling the campsite for several minutes before the dog bolted and had been preparing to call out a warning. Brock grabbed the bear spray canister from the picnic table. He ripped off the safety clip, but instead of properly aiming it, he overhand threw the canister toward the bear like a makeshift grenade. It struck the animal near the left shoulder and dropped into the brush. At this point, as I read through the story, I'm facepalming in real time. The bear halted its pursuit of the dog. It turned toward Brock. Petrov later described a brief, unnatural stillness before it lowered its head and began advancing in a direct, steady line, closing distance with deliberate pressure before dropping fully into motion. Brock ran toward the truck, but the terrain was uneven, wet from the previous night's rain. He slipped and went down hard on his left knee within the first 10 feet. He did not get back up before the bear reached him. Dara, now inside the truck, reported hearing the impact, a sound she described to rangers as similar to something being dropped from height onto wet ground. The bear first used its forepaws, knocking Brock off balance and collapsing his left side as he fell back into the ground cover. He tried to curl away, but the animal followed immediately, switching from swats to a bite aimed at his upper torso, shaking him. The combination of force and weight did most of the damage in seconds, leaving him unable to move or respond. Petrov, who remained at distance, said the attack continued for what he estimated was between 90 seconds and 2 minutes before the bear disengaged and moved back into the brush. Brock was non-responsive before it left. Petrov activated his satellite communicator, and rangers reached the site moments later, only pronouncing death on sight. The coroner's report noted blunt force and lacerating trauma to the thoracic cavity, left arm, and neck consistent with bear attack. Cause of death was hemorrhagic shock, secondary to multiple deep lacerations and crush injury. Time of death was estimated within minutes of the attack. Wildlife officers flagged the incident under improper deterrent use. The bear was never located. I think Brock was not a reckless man. He was simply a man handed a tool he had never been shown how to use in a situation he had never been trained to assess. That gap is the tragedy here. Not stupidity, but genuine unpreparedness, treated as a minor detail right up until it wasn't. It was October 8, 2017, along the Northern California coast, and this wasn't just any normal surf day. This was peak season for great white sharks, the time of year when the water basically turns into an active hunting ground. That stretch of coastline had seen a surge in elephant seal populations, which meant one thing: great whites weren't just passing through, they were staying there to hunt. Soren Arlo, 31, was a freelance graphic designer from San Francisco who had been surfing for about 5 years. Decent experience, but not exactly someone you'd expect to handle high-risk conditions. And this is where things start to feel a bit too predictable. That weekend, he met a marine biology student at a coffee shop. They talked, and she mentioned she'd be at a nearby beach doing research the next morning. And I think this might have been the moment things shifted for him. You know when someone suddenly feels like they have something to prove? Soren shows up early the next day. The beach is mostly empty, except for a small research team, and there are warning signs posted around the area. Recent shark sightings, increased activity, all of it clearly laid out. And it wasn't just signs. The marine biology student actually spoke to him directly. She explained what was going on, that sharks had been actively feeding near the shoreline because of the seal colony, and told him it wasn't safe to go into the water. At that point, it's hard to ignore. Like, you're not guessing anymore. You're being told straight up. But Soren brushes it off. He claims he surfed similar conditions before, which from what we know wasn't really true. And I've seen this kind of overconfidence before. It's like people feel the need to live up to an image instead of just being honest about their limits. Because realistically, nothing would have happened if he just stayed on shore. Instead, he paddles out. And not just anywhere, he positions himself directly over the seal feeding zone, the exact spot researchers had already identified as the highest risk. Which makes me think, was he even processing what he'd just been told? The attack happens without warning. A great white shark comes from below and strikes with full force, mistaking his silhouette for a seal. One powerful bite to the upper thigh, and it severs his femoral artery instantly. Soren manages to scream once before falling off his board, the water around him quickly turning dark with blood. On shore, the research team reacts immediately. They shout warnings, call emergency services, and attempt to paddle out toward him. But the distance and how fast everything happened made any real rescue impossible. The shark releases after the initial bite, which is typical behavior once they realize it's not their usual prey. The water settles almost as quickly as it erupted. Emergency responders arrived shortly after and recovered Soren's body 3 hours later, still tethered to his surfboard by the ankle leash. The bite had caused catastrophic damage to his femoral artery, leading to rapid blood loss within minutes. The medical examiner ruled the case an accidental death caused by a shark attack, citing fatal blood loss and subsequent drowning. Statements from the research team, including their direct warnings to Soren, were included in the official investigation. Following the incident, the beach implemented stricter safety measures, including mandatory advisories and increased monitoring during periods of heightened shark activity. It was June 14, 2016, outside Cody, Wyoming, where the Absaroka Range cuts into the sky like broken teeth and the wind carries the smell of pine and something older. The kind of country that doesn't negotiate. Evan James Mallory, 31, worked IT support for a mid-sized logistics company in Boise, Idaho. He was the guy who fixed your printer and quietly resented it. What gave him purpose was the Pacific Northwest LARP community, where he played a druid named Calden Moore, the Patient. He was respected in that world, a scene coordinator, a lore keeper, someone people listened to. He'd driven 9 hours to attend the Renaissance Fair near Cody with his girlfriend, Priya Nath. The fair was incidental. For Evan, the Absaroka backcountry was the real draw. Priya later said that he'd mentioned more than once that getting into character meant getting into nature. The trail they took climbed a sagebrush slope above the Shoshone River basin, opening into a subalpine clearing roughly 2 miles from the trailhead. Grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are not rare. Population estimates in 2016 placed over 700 animals in the region. Adult males average 400 to 600 pounds and can sprint 35 miles per hour. Their charge response can be triggered by sudden arm movement, direct eye contact, or perceived advance into their space. Bears in early summer are calorie deficient after hibernation, which elevates aggression. A trail information board at the trailhead posted an active bear warning, recent grizzly sightings within a mile of the area. A ranger had also verbally flagged it to fair attendees that morning. Priya later told investigators she remembered seeing the sign. She also said Evan had pointed up the ridge and said something to the effect that the bear was far enough and that he wanted to see how close he could get before it moved off. He carried bear spray clipped to his satchel. She stayed back. Evan moved upslope toward the ridge. The bear, an adult male, was roughly 80 yards out but already moving along the tree line and slowly closing distance toward the same drainage, feeding and drifting between brush patches. By the time Evan stopped, the space between them had narrowed to about 40 yards, with the bear now fully aware of their presence. Evan raised his staff with one arm extended wide, a gesture pulled from his LARP lexicon, meant to signal peaceful intent. The sudden arm movement likely contributed to the bear's shift in attention. The bear stopped feeding. What happened next took under 6 seconds. The grizzly dropped its head and came straight downhill. Evan reached behind his back for the bear spray. The wind was blowing toward him at roughly 10 miles per hour. He discharged the canister only when the bear had closed to roughly 25 feet. The spray blew back directly into his face at close range. He went down immediately, partially blinded and choking. The staff fell. The bear did not slow. The first contact knocked Evan backward onto the slope. The bear bit into his left shoulder and shook, dislocating the joint and fracturing the clavicle before shifting its attention higher toward his head. Priya ran downhill screaming. A day hiker lower on the trail heard her and called 911. Terrain delayed emergency response to approximately 32 minutes. Mallory was pronounced dead at the scene by rescue personnel after a brief field assessment. Within the LARP community, Evan's death prompted a brief wave of posts and tribute sessions where participants shared memories of his character work and coordination efforts. An in-character memorial event was held in his honor, but the discussion surrounding the incident quickly shifted toward safety boundaries. In outdoor roleplay settings, I don't mock Evan Mallory. He was someone who built meaning through imagination, and that's not a character flaw, but imagination has no authority over 500 pounds of bear. The costume, the staff, the gesture, none of it meant anything to the animal coming down that ridge. It never does. It was June 9, 2016, and the South Texas heat had settled over the scrubland outside Laredo like a weight that didn't lift, even as the afternoon stretched toward evening. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of day where shadows go flat and the air smells faintly of dust and dry grass. On a rural property set back from the main road, a chain-link enclosure sat behind a low outbuilding, its wooden support posts weathered from years of sun exposure. Victor Salinas, 42, had operated an unaccredited roadside animal exhibit on that property for several years. He wasn't a trained zoologist or a licensed facility operator. He was someone who had built something unconventional and kept building it, driven by a genuine fascination with animals that most people only ever see behind institutional glass. Texas law required registration with local authorities and liability insurance for dangerous wild animals, but enforcement varied heavily by county, and in the rural stretch outside Laredo, the paperwork existed somewhere between informal and non-existent. I don't say that to excuse what followed, but I think it matters for understanding how someone ends up in a situation like this. Passion and proximity are a combination that requires structure to be safe, and structure was something Victor's operation consistently lacked. The centerpiece of the property was an adult male African lion, weighing approximately 420 pounds. African lions are apex predators, built for explosive short-distance pursuit. They can accelerate to 50 miles per hour in seconds, and are capable of delivering a bite force exceeding 650 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone without effort. What most people don't know is that lions are highly attuned to feeding schedules. In captivity, irregular timing doesn't make them calmer. It makes them more reactive, more alert to the moment food arrives, and more likely to respond to entry as a feeding trigger rather than a routine interaction. Victor's feeding times were inconsistent, sometimes delayed by hours. That inconsistency in an animal of this size and temperament was not a minor detail. No secondary containment barriers had been installed. Neighbors had raised concerns more than once about the fencing and the practice of entering the enclosure during feeding rather than using an external delivery system. Standard safety practices for large predator management are unambiguous on this point. Shared space feeding is not a procedure, it's a gamble. Victor had taken that gamble many times. On June 9th, the odds caught up. The afternoon had already run long. Feeding was delayed past its usual window, and Victor entered the enclosure carrying exposed raw meat, the same way he had done countless times before. I keep coming back to that phrase, the same way he had done countless times before. It appears in almost every one of these cases, and every time it means the same thing. The routine had become the risk. The lion advanced the moment Victor stepped through the gate, closing the distance before the food could be placed. The response was immediate and consistent with a feeding-triggered reaction in a large predator that had been waiting past its expected mealtime. Disturbed ground and drag marks near the entry point told the story of what followed. The attack happened fast, within a short distance of where Victor had entered, leaving almost no time between the gate closing and the moment everything changed. Nearby residents reported a brief animal disturbance, then silence. Victor was found later that evening by a family member. The lion was euthanized on site by responding authorities, and the property was shut down immediately. The incident prompted a local review of privately maintained exotic animal enclosures in the region, though the findings were largely informal. There's something about this case that I find particularly difficult to sit with. Victor had been doing this for years. The lion had never seriously injured anyone. And that history, I think, was exactly the problem. Every uneventful feeding made the next one feel safer than it was, until the one that wasn't. It was March 18, 2017, in a remote coastal region of northern Australia, where mangrove-lined riverbanks stretched along slow-moving tidal channels that pushed inland from the sea. The terrain was dense and low, the ground shifting between firm and soft without warning, and the line between land and water was never entirely clear. The water itself was the color of dark tea, stained by tannins from the surrounding vegetation, and the incoming tide was pushing it further up the bank, narrowing the dry ground and reducing visibility near the shoreline to near zero. Brandon Cole, 27, was a fitness content creator from California. He was physically confident, accustomed to outdoor environments, and had joined a small locally guided wildlife excursion through the region as part of a broader travel itinerary. He had no formal background in wildlife or field safety, but he was the kind of person who moved through unfamiliar environments with ease, rarely treating new situations as something that required adjustment. The tour itself was minimal in structure. One guide, a small group of travelers, and marked but unfenced terrain along tidal waterways. No barriers, no elevated platforms, and no physical separation between the group and the environment they were moving through. It was the kind of setup that works perfectly well when everyone follows the rules, and becomes something else entirely when someone doesn't. The first portion of the excursion passed without issue. The group moved along the riverbank at a measured pace, observing tracks pressed into the mud and environmental markers the guide pointed out along the way. The guide had established one consistent rule from the start: maintain at least 20 to 25 feet from the water's edge at all times. He had explained the reasoning clearly. The murky water made it impossible to see what was beneath the surface, and the incoming tide was pushing the effective range of the bank closer to the group with every passing minute. The rule was not a suggestion. It was the only reliable margin of safety available in that environment. And in my experience researching these cases, guides who work tidal crocodile habitat don't repeat that instruction casually. They repeat it because they've seen what happens when it isn't followed. At approximately 11:20 a.m., the group paused near a section of muddy riverbank where tracks had been spotted earlier that morning. The guide repeated the distance instruction clearly before anyone moved. What most people don't fully appreciate about saltwater crocodiles is how completely the animal is built around a single moment. I've read through enough incident reports to know that the victims almost never see it coming, not because they weren't paying attention, but because the animal is specifically designed to prevent that. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles on Earth. Adults regularly exceed 17 feet in length and can weigh over 2,000 pounds. They are capable of remaining completely motionless beneath the surface for extended periods, with only their eyes and nostrils above the waterline, and in murky or tidal water, even those are invisible. They do not stalk in the way a land predator stalks. They position themselves and they wait. Once triggered, the strike is committed. The lunge covers distance in a fraction of a second, and the force of the initial bite is enough to drag an adult human off their feet before any resistance is possible. The animal does not need to chase. It only needs the target to come close enough. Brandon moved closer to the bank. He closed the gap to less than 10 feet, stepping onto damp, unstable mud at the water's edge to get a clearer view of the shoreline. As he adjusted his footing, a section of the bank gave way slightly beneath him, a small collapse, no more than a few inches, but enough to send a brief and distinct vibration through the mud and into the water directly below. The noise was minimal. The movement was enough. The crocodile was already there. The attack came without any preceding surface disturbance, an upward lunge that closed the remaining distance before Brandon could recover his balance. The terrain offered no stable footing to push back from, and the proximity left the guide with no effective window to intervene. From everything I've studied about crocodile attacks in tidal environments, this is exactly the scenario that guides in Northern Australia describe as the most difficult to prevent. The water looks empty, the bank looks stable, and by the time anything changes, the window to act is already gone. Brandon's remains were recovered with the assistance of local wildlife authorities over the following day. The guide was cleared of negligence, having issued repeated and explicit distance warnings throughout the excursion. The tour operation was reviewed internally, with stricter boundary enforcement implemented at all water stops going forward, physical markers placed at the required distance from the bank, and a policy requiring the group to remain stationary and together during any pause near the water. There was no extended media coverage, and the incident was documented in regional wildlife safety records and referenced in subsequent guide training in the area. Saltwater crocodile attacks in Northern Australia follow a consistent pattern in the documented record. The victim is almost always within 10 feet of the water's edge. The water is almost always murky or tidal, and there is almost always a guide instruction that was not followed. Brandon's case fits that pattern precisely, which is part of what makes it so difficult to set aside. The outcome was not unpredictable. It was the direct result of a single decision to close a distance that had been established specifically to prevent it. Even in environments where the danger is clearly communicated, the threat itself remains invisible until the moment it acts. The next case is different in setting, colder, more remote, and involving an animal that most people would not immediately associate with lethal predatory behavior. But the underlying dynamic is the same: a predator operating from below the surface in water that gave no indication of what it contained. It was February 19th, 2014, at an aquarium facility in Savannah, Georgia, where a large open ocean exhibit was viewed through an underwater tunnel built into the public observation area. The tank contained multiple large marine predators under controlled environmental systems and routine safety protocols. Elvo Dantry was 29, from coastal Georgia, working in aquarium maintenance for just over a year. He held an associate degree in environmental science and was employed during a staffing shortage in a non-lead technical role. He was considered reliable and procedure-oriented, though not cleared for unsupervised high-risk dive entry. He was not scheduled for a solo maintenance dive that morning. That sentence is doing a lot of work. He wasn't supposed to be in that water. The main exhibit held approximately 280,000 gallons and contained 3 sand tiger sharks, a species generally considered low aggression toward divers in controlled aquarium settings, though activity levels can increase when feeding schedules are disrupted, especially in confined environments. That morning, feeding had been delayed due to internal scheduling changes. Staff logs noted elevated animal activity earlier in the day and recommended postponing any non-essential in-water work until feeding was completed and behavior stabilized. The advisory was not confirmed as acknowledged, and no physical dive lockout was in place at the entry point. A school group was present in the viewing tunnel beneath the tank, observing the exhibit as Elvo entered for what was intended to be a routine maintenance dive. Initial conditions inside the tank appeared stable. Water clarity was slightly reduced due to prior sediment disturbance, but visibility remained functional. Elvo began standard maintenance movements along the interior structure while monitoring shark spacing, which initially remained at a typical distance. As work continued, one shark moved in, closer than expected, and made direct contact with his arm. In confined aquarium environments, such contact is often classified as investigatory rather than predatory, but the force of the impact disrupted his balance against the acrylic boundary and caused immediate loss of tool control. Within seconds, additional close-range movement occurred in the same area of the tank as the other sharks adjusted position in response to the disturbance and shifting water pressure. Their movement remained consistent with reactive repositioning rather than coordinated aggression, but the confined environment reduced available escape space and amplified water displacement. This combination of limited maneuverability and disrupted orientation further compromised Elvo's ability to stabilize following the initial contact. Visibility degraded slightly as disturbed sediment and fine particulate matter spread through the water column near the tank floor. From the viewing tunnel, observers could see irregular movement patterns, but not clearly distinguish full detail of the interaction unfolding above. Surface staff recognized the escalation and initiated emergency response procedures, including immediate dive team activation and tank access coordination. A supervisor reached the entry point and entered the water to assist in controlled recovery as Elvo attempted to regain orientation and move toward the ascent area. Someone went in after him. I want you to hold on to that. However, his condition deteriorated rapidly following the initial high-force bite, which resulted in deep laceration and major vascular injury to the upper limb. Blood loss was immediate and significant, and combined with disorientation in the confined environment, his ability to stabilize and exit the water was compromised. Emergency extraction was completed, and Elvo was removed from the tank and transferred to on-site stabilization, where paramedics initiated hemorrhage control, fluid resuscitation, and airway management before rapid transport to hospital. Despite immediate surgical intervention, he died from exsanguination due to severe vascular injuries sustained in the tank. Medical documentation confirmed a primary deep bite-related laceration with associated vascular injury, consistent with high-force contact in a confined environment, leading to rapid and uncontrolled blood loss. Regulatory review found failures in buddy diving enforcement, hazard communication, and dive authorization during altered feeding conditions, resulting in fines and required safety revisions. It was September 19th, 2015, deep in the wilderness of Montana, and this was one of those seasons where grizzly bear activity was higher than usual. The kind of time when experienced hunters start being extra cautious, not less. Because out there, you're not at the top of the food chain. Gideon Rusk, 45, was a bow hunter from Colorado with over 20 years of experience. And not just casual experience, he was serious about it. The kind of guy who invested heavily in his gear. Custom bows, premium. Optics, specialized equipment, everything top tier. I've seen people like this before, where the gear isn't just equipment, it's almost personal. Like losing it would feel worse than it probably should. Gideon had spent close to $8,000 on this hunting trip, and part of that included a set of limited edition arrows he'd been talking about for months. So when things didn't go as planned, he took it harder than most would. During the hunt, he spotted a large bull elk and took his shot, but it wasn't clean. The arrow struck poorly, and the elk bolted into thick brush, disappearing into dense cover with one of those expensive arrows still lodged in its body. And I get it, missing a shot like that probably feels frustrating, maybe even embarrassing, but this is where things start to shift. His hunting partner immediately noticed warning signs: fresh grizzly scat, claw marks on nearby trees, disturbed ground. All clear indicators that a bear had been in the area recently. And from what I've heard, that's usually your cue to back off, especially when visibility is low and you're dealing with wounded prey. But Gideon couldn't let it go. His partner warned him not to go in. Gideon went anyway. He convinced himself he could move quickly, grab the arrow, and get out. In his mind, it probably felt controlled, manageable. But the moment he stepped into that brush, everything changed. The visibility dropped almost instantly. Thick vegetation, limited sight lines. You're basically moving blind at that point. And instead of scanning ahead, Gideon was focused on the ground, following the blood trail. What he didn't realize was that something else had already found the elk, a grizzly bear. And not just passing through, it had claimed the elk as a food source. Which makes this situation even worse, because now it's not just about crossing paths with a predator. It's about walking into something it's actively protecting. When Gideon pushed through the brush and entered the clearing, he walked straight into it. No warning, no time to react. The bear charged immediately, and this is the part people underestimate, how fast they move. There's no buildup, no chance to think things through. 1 second it's there, the next, it's on you. Gideon barely had time to register what was happening before the grizzly closed the distance. The impact knocked him to the ground, and within seconds, the bear delivered a crushing bite to his head and neck. The force alone was catastrophic. His hunting partner, about 250 yards away, heard the noise, shouting, crashing brush, then silence. He started yelling, banging equipment together, trying to scare the bear off, but it was already over. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute. By the time his partner reached the scene, Gideon was lying near the elk carcass, unresponsive. The injuries were severe. His cervical spine and trachea had been crushed, causing immediate death. The arrow he had gone in to retrieve was still lodged in the elk, exactly where the bear had been feeding. Wildlife officials later investigated and determined the bear had acted defensively while protecting its food source, which is standard behavior in that situation. Due to the fatal nature of the attack, the bear was located and euthanized in accordance with wildlife management protocols. The case was ruled an accidental death resulting from a wildlife encounter. Investigators noted that entering an active feeding site significantly increased the risk of a defensive attack. The outfitter involved in the trip later reinforced safety guidelines, emphasizing that no equipment should be retrieved under those conditions. It was July 2nd, 2017. The coastline near the northern edge of Alaska was caught between seasons that morning. The sea ice had receded further than usual for the time of year, leaving long stretches of open water along the shore, and the air carried the particular cold, wet smell of an Arctic coast in summer, where the temperature is mild enough to keep the ground soft, but cold enough that breath is still visible. Andrew Kent was 45 years old and had been working in field research in Arctic environments for the better part of 2 decades. Jenna Cole was 32 and had joined the project the previous season, working alongside Andrew on coastal wildlife documentation. Both of them were experienced in the practical demands of fieldwork in this environment. They understood the landscape, understood the conditions, and understood, in the abstract, the risks that came with operating in polar bear habitat along an active coastline in summer. What they did not fully account for that morning was the specific risk created by their position relative to the seals they had come to observe. They had positioned themselves at the ice edge to observe a group of seals resting on a remaining ice shelf several meters offshore. Ice edges are primary hunting locations for polar bears during the period when sea ice is retreating. The seals that use the remaining ice for hauling out are concentrated in predictable locations, and polar bears that are hunting in this season know those locations and work them systematically. A researcher positioned at the ice edge to observe seals has, functionally, placed themselves inside the approach corridor that a hunting polar bear would use to reach those same seals. The human presence at that location does not alter the bear's assessment of the area as a viable hunting site. It simply means that when the bear approaches, the humans are already there. This is the part I return to most in this case. They were not careless. They were doing exactly what they came to do, in exactly the right place to do it. The environment did not distinguish between their intentions and their position. The bear had approached from downwind, moving along the ice edge in a way that kept it below the sightline of anyone watching the water, rather than the land behind them. And the pressure hummocks and irregular ice ridges along that edge had broken the sightline further, the bear using that terrain the way it uses any available cover. It closed to under 25 meters before either Andrew or Jenna was aware of its presence. At that range, a polar bear that is committed to a charge covers the distance before a person can process the information and generate a coordinated physical response. The bear charged and targeted Jenna. She had been the first point of scent and visual confirmation as the bear completed its approach. The figure the animal had been tracking for the final stretch of its advance, and the one whose movement registered first at the moment the charge began. Andrew crossed directly into the line of the attack, not simply moving toward Jenna, but entering the space between the bear and its target at the moment the animal was already in committed motion. That physical interruption drew a defensive strike from the bear before it recommitted to the primary target. It was not a sustained redirection, and the bear did not shift its focus cleanly between the two of them. It was a momentary response to an obstruction that had placed itself in its path, followed by a return to the point of initial engagement. The attack resulted in one fatality and one severe injury. The response team that reached the site was operating out of a forward field station roughly 40 minutes away by all-terrain vehicle across coastal terrain, a realistic interval given the remoteness of the site and the absence of helicopter support that morning. The bear was located and shot after their arrival. The ice edge where the encounter occurred was closed to unsupported fieldwork for the remainder of the season. It was November 6th, 2014, along a remote Antarctic shoreline where low ice shelves met dark, near freezing water under a pale and cloudless sky. The landscape was open and stripped of anything that could be described as cover, flat ice, gray water, and a horizon that offered no reference point for scale or distance. The conditions that afternoon were as stable as they ever get that far south. Clear visibility, minimal wind, and a flat surface on the water that reflected the sky almost perfectly. Claire Dubois, 35, was a documentary editor from France. She had spent years working with footage from remote environments, editing sequences that other people had filmed in places exactly like this one. And the trip to Antarctica was something she had planned for a long time. She joined a small private expedition to the region as a personal trip, traveling with a group of roughly 8 people under the supervision of 2 experienced polar guides. Landings on ice-covered terrain were short, timed, and conducted with clear protocols about where the group could move and how close they could get to the water's edge. The guides were not casual about the rules. They had worked in polar environments long, enough to understand that the conditions that look the safest are often the ones that carry the most risk. Claire had followed the group's protocols without issue throughout the earlier portion of the expedition. She was methodical by nature and had not given the guides any reason for concern during the previous landings. The stop on November 6th was treated as routine, a short landing on a stable section of ice shelf with the group spread out but within sight of one another, and both guides positioned to monitor movement near the water. At approximately 2:15 p.m., Claire was positioned along the low edge of the ice shelf, within a few feet of the waterline. The ice at that section was flat and solid, and the water below was dark and completely still. She crouched low to stabilize herself and extended one hand briefly into the water. Leopard seals are not an animal that most people think of as dangerous, and I think that gap between perception and reality is exactly what makes encounters with them so hard to prepare for. People picture seals as docile, almost clumsy animals, and for most species, that's not entirely wrong. Leopard seals are a different category entirely. Adults reach up to 11 feet in length and can weigh over 1,000 pounds. Their build is elongated and muscular, with a disproportionately large head and jaws designed for gripping and tearing, rather than the fish-catching mechanics of most other seal species. They are apex hunters in their environment, and their primary prey, penguins, are caught through ambush from below. The seal positions itself beneath the surface, near areas where penguins enter or exit the water, and strikes upward with explosive speed when movement is detected above. They do not circle or signal. They do not investigate cautiously. They approach from depth, and the first indication of their presence is the strike itself. When contact is made, they pull downward, using their body weight and the resistance of the water to maintain control of whatever they have caught. That last detail is the one that I think people least expect. It is not a single strike and release. The animal is built to hold on and pull down. The attack came from beneath the water, without any visible warning. The surface had shown nothing. No ripple, no shadow, no movement of any kind. The seal surged upward from below, made contact with Claire's arm and upper body, and pulled her from the ice shelf and into the water before either guide could close the distance. The water temperature in that region sits near 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The guides reached the edge within seconds and worked to pull her back onto the ice. But the time she spent submerged, combined with the trauma from the initial strike and the effect of the water temperature on her body, had already determined the outcome. She did not survive. I've come across a small number of documented leopard seal incidents involving researchers and divers near the ice edge, and what stands out in almost every case is how little warning preceded the contact. There is a prior fatal case in the research record involving a marine biologist pulled underwater in similar circumstances off the Antarctic Peninsula. The behavior is rare, but it is not without precedent, and the animal in Claire's case was not acting outside its natural patterns. It detected movement at the surface and responded to it the same way it would respond to a penguin entering the water. The fact that the target was a person made no difference to the animal. That is something I find genuinely difficult to sit with. The complete absence of intent on the animal's part, and the complete finality of the outcome, regardless. The expedition operator revised its internal landing procedures following the incident. Future landings required all group members to remain a minimum of 6 feet from the ice edge during any shoreline stop, regardless of conditions or visibility. What makes this case particularly difficult is that nothing about the environment looked dangerous. The water was calm, the weather was clear, and the group was supervised. The threat existed entirely below the surface, invisible and already in position before anyone on the ice shelf had any reason to look for it. A single brief movement at the water's edge was enough to trigger a response that the environment made impossible to survive. Not every dangerous encounter in the wild is hidden beneath the surface. Nico Draven was a 22-year-old psychology student from Ohio. He grew up in a pretty typical suburban environment, where the closest thing to a wild animal was something behind thick glass at a proper zoo. But he had this fascination with big cats, posters all over his dorm, hours of wildlife documentaries, reading into animal behavior. At some point, it started to shape how he saw them. Not as unpredictable predators, but as something almost understandable, maybe even approachable. And I think that's where things started to blur for him. Because watching animals on a screen is one thing, being near one in real life is completely different. During a road trip through Oklahoma, he and his girlfriend stopped at a roadside zoo, one of those places with chain link fences, warning signs, and minimal supervision. Visitors walked around, took pictures, and kept their distance. At least, most of them did. After the facility closed, Nico convinced his girlfriend to stay a bit longer. He wanted to observe the animals without the crowd around, said it would give him a better sense of their behavior, and I get being curious. But there's a difference between observing and getting involved. When he spotted a large male lion resting near the inner enclosure, he saw something else entirely. To him, the lion didn't look threatening. It looked calm, almost lazy, like it didn't care about anything happening around it, which I think made him feel like it was safe. His girlfriend told him not to go any closer. He ignored her. Nico climbed over the 8-foot outer fence, bypassing multiple warning signs, and made his way toward the inner enclosure. And this is one of those moments where it's like there were so many chances to stop, but he kept going. The lion remained still, eyes half closed, barely reacting. And I've seen people mistake that kind of stillness before. It looks peaceful, but it's not the same as harmless. Nico stepped closer. Then he reached through the bars. The reaction was instant. The lion surged forward and grabbed his arm and shoulder, pulling him violently against the enclosure. The force alone pinned him there, leaving him no way to pull back. His screams were brief. The lion adjusted its grip and delivered a crushing bite to his neck, causing massive trauma almost immediately. The pressure from the jaws likely severed major blood vessels within seconds. The entire attack lasted only moments. By the time the lion released, the damage was already fatal. Outside the fence, his girlfriend could only watch, screaming for help, unable to reach him or do anything to stop it. Staff and emergency responders arrived shortly after, but there was nothing left to be done. Nico was found slumped against the enclosure, unresponsive, with injuries consistent with a fatal bite to the neck. The medical examiner ruled the case an accidental death caused by a lion attack, citing catastrophic vascular trauma. Investigators confirmed that Nico had deliberately bypassed multiple safety barriers. The lion's behavior was determined to be consistent with a territorial predator, responding to an intrusion. Following the incident, the facility installed higher perimeter fencing and increased security measures. Local authorities also used the case to push for stricter regulations on roadside zoos. The lion remained at the facility, as officials determined it had acted within normal behavioral patterns. It was March 14th, 2018, on a 340-acre private compound outside Missoula. Cold and still in the early morning. The kind of quiet that comes from being far enough from everything that no outside sound reaches the property. Dale Crawford was 54 and had built a technology infrastructure company in Seattle into something large enough that a European consortium had spent 3 years trying to buy it, with a final investor meeting scheduled for that morning. He had moved to the Montana compound a few years earlier after regulatory scrutiny around his business. The property included multiple outbuildings, one of which had been constructed without permits and was not accurately listed in property records. That outbuilding housed a 5-year-old male lion named Aries. On paper, the animal was owned by a licensed exotic exhibitor, leasing space on the property under the Animal Welfare Act. In practice, Crawford had sourced the animal through brokers and made decisions about its care. The arrangement had not been recently inspected and did not meet proper separation standards. The caretaker, Roy Morrow, had reported for weeks that the enclosure latch was degrading and misaligned, weakened further by repeated pressure from the animal. 11 days before the meeting, a replacement part was ordered. In the meantime, a secondary chain and a consumer padlock were added. No additional restrictions were put in place around the enclosure. I want to be fair. I understand that people convince themselves things are handled. This was not handled. The meeting began at 10 a.m., with participants both on-site and remote. Catering activity in the main house carried noise and food scent outward. The lion returned to the weakened latch point, applied force, and the primary latch failed. The chain held briefly before the padlock housing fractured. The gate opened. The enclosure sat about 80 meters from the main house. The lion reached the structure in under a minute and entered through a service corridor door left open for catering. Inside, it moved toward the source of sound and activity, pausing briefly at the meeting room entrance before entering. It focused on movement, reached Dale Crawford, and took him to the ground before anyone could respond. The attack was rapid and forceful. One attendee attempting to exit was seriously injured, while another escaped through a side door. Remote participants witnessed the entry before the feed cut. Roy Morrow, already nearby due to repeated checks, saw the animal move toward the house and retrieved a dart rifle. He reached the scene within minutes. Emergency services had been called, but rural response time exceeded 30 minutes. A first dart slowed the animal, and a second was required. Full immobilization took additional time. Crawford was pronounced dead at the scene. The injured attendee was airlifted to hospital. The investigation cited violations of the Animal Welfare Act and related statutes. The unlicensed structure and prior maintenance reports were noted. A civil case followed. The acquisition collapsed under a morality clause, and the animal was later transferred to an accredited sanctuary. It was July 9, 2018, in a remote section of the Okavango Delta in Botswana, where open grassland stretched wide between patches of dense brush and the morning air was still cool from the night before. The light was flat and clear, and visibility across the plain extended for several hundred yards in every direction. There was nothing subtle about the landscape. It was open ground, and everything on it was visible. Victor Ramirez, 39, was a business owner from Florida. He ran a mid-sized logistics company, was accustomed to making decisions quickly, and carried the kind of practical confidence that comes from years of managing operations under pressure. He had booked a privately guided safari through the Okavango as part of a longer trip through southern Africa, his first time on the continent. The tour operated with one guide and a small group in an open vehicle. Victor had no prior safari experience, but he had done enough research to feel prepared, and that sense of preparation shaped how he engaged with the environment from the first morning. In my experience going through safari incident records, that combination, first-time visitor, high personal confidence, no formal wildlife, background, appears more often than it should in cases that end badly. The trip had gone well through the first day and a half. The group had covered significant ground, observed a range of wildlife from the vehicle, and the guide had maintained a consistent and professional approach throughout. At approximately 8:30 a.m. on July 9th, the vehicle stopped on open ground, roughly 60 yards from a solitary Cape buffalo standing near a line of low vegetation at the edge of the plain. The guide read the situation immediately. A lone bull, separated from any herd, standing in the open and already oriented toward the vehicle. He communicated the assessment to the group clearly. No one was to stand or make sudden movements. This is the part of the story that I find genuinely hard to understand. Even after going through cases like this repeatedly, the guide had already told the group what they were looking at. The animal was visible. The risk was not abstract. It was standing 60 yards away, in open ground. And still, what happened next happened. There is a reason that Cape buffalo appear consistently at the top of documented large animal fatality records in sub-Saharan Africa. Adult bulls weigh up to 1,500 pounds and can reach speeds approaching 35 miles per hour in a charge, fast enough to cover 60 yards in under 4 seconds. Their horns fuse at the base as they age, forming a dense, hardened boss across the forehead that functions as a solid battering structure. When a Cape buffalo charges, it does not veer. It targets the source of the disturbance and drives into it with full body weight at full speed. Older bulls that have separated from the herd, referred to in the region as Daga boys, are consistently more dangerous than herd animals. They are more alert, more territorial, and more likely to treat any unfamiliar presence as a direct threat rather than something to be assessed and avoided. A lone Daga boy, standing in the open and watching a vehicle, is not a passive animal. It has already registered the intrusion and is deciding how to respond to it. I've read accounts from guides who describe that moment, the animal standing still, watching, as the most dangerous phase of the encounter, because it means the animal is already engaged. Victor stood up inside the open vehicle, raising his upper body above the frame and making loud, sudden movements that carried across the open ground. The guide instructed him to sit down. Victor remained standing. The bull's response was immediate. Its head dropped, its ears flattened against its skull, its tail lifted. The full sequence of pre-charge behavior compressed into less than 2 seconds, and then it moved. At 60 yards and 35 miles per hour, the time between the initiation of the charge and impact was under 4 seconds. The guide attempted to reposition the vehicle, but the distance was too short, and Victor was still fully exposed above the frame, with no time to drop back into the seat. The Buffalo struck the front side of the vehicle at full speed. Victor took the primary force of the impact directly, the boss connecting with his body and driving him backward with the full weight of the animal behind it. The guide radioed for emergency assistance immediately and worked to keep the animal from returning while attending to Victor. Emergency services reached the location approximately 50 minutes later. Victor was unresponsive by the time help arrived and was pronounced dead at the scene. The internal injuries sustained in the impact were not survivable in the field, and the evacuation time made any intervention impossible regardless. The guide was cleared of any negligence. He had correctly identified the animal as high risk from the moment the vehicle stopped and had no physical means of forcing compliance once Victor had made his decision. From my own research into large herbivore attacks, what strikes me most about Cape Buffalo incidents is how, consistently, the outcome is determined before the charge even begins. The animal's behavior in the seconds before it moves tells you exactly what is about to happen. The guides know it. The problem is that the people who most need to respond to that information are often the ones least inclined to take it seriously. By the time the charge begins, the decision has already been made, and not by the animal. The case was incorporated into guide training by the regional safari operator as a reference point for managing non-compliant guests in open vehicle situation. The buffalo was not pursued. It had acted entirely within the behavioral patterns of its species. An open vehicle in large herbivore territory is not a comfortable platform for observation. It is the only barrier available. The moment a person rises above it, they become the most visible and exposed element in the environment. And in a landscape where animals like Cape buffalo operate, that exposure is not a calculated risk. It is the removal of the only protection that existed. The first 3 cases in this episode all involved animals that reacted to something they could directly detect. Movement at the water's edge, a hand breaking the surface, a figure rising above a vehicle frame. The final case carries a different quality entirely. There was no visible animal, no warning behavior, and no single moment of obvious poor judgment. There was only a set of environmental conditions that had been building quietly across several days, and a routine that had never been tested until the morning it was.